International Affairs here in Sydney. It's a very great pleasure this evening to introduce Susannah Patton, Director of the Southeast Asian Program at the Lowy Institute. Susannah is the project leader for the Asian Power Index, which is the Lowy Institute's annual assessment mapping the changing distribution of power in the region, and it's data-driven. I recall from earlier launches here how very much data appeared on the screens, and I suspect it's going to do some. Not going to take your time up with any attempt to say anything sensible about the Asian Power Index. Just very warm welcome to Susannah and offside notes. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here this evening and to have the chance to present the findings of the Power Index to you. My colleague Jack Sato is the data analyst on the Asian Power Index project, which, as you'll come to see from the presentation, is a very important position because we're dealing with a huge amount of data here. So I know that my colleague Hervé Lemahue, who established the Asian Power Index 5 years ago, has presented at the AAAA previously. So I'm not sure how many of you have seen a presentation of the Asian Power Index before. Can I get any hands? Okay, only one. All right, that's just good to know because it tells me how much detail I should give you about the methodology, which is consistent over the 5 years. Next slide. So the Asia Power Index was established by the Lowy Institute 5 years ago to measure comprehensive power of 26 countries in Asia, from as far west as Pakistan through to the United States in the east. We include Australia, PNG, Russia, so it's an eclectic mix of countries, and I'm happy to talk more in the discussion about why these 26 countries and how other countries from outside this geographic scope might fit into the picture. In terms of the methodology though, we break power down into 8 measures, which you can see on the screen there. So we look at both resources, which is what countries have, and influence, what they do with what they have. So by resources, we're looking at economic capability, military capability, future resources, which takes into account, for example, demographic trends. We know that some countries still have a dividend to come while others don't, and resilience, so how resilient countries are to external pressure. And then on the influence side, we're looking at the relationships that these 26 countries have with each other on all the dimensions that you can see there, so from economic relationships through to their defence networks. I should say that all of those 8 measures, which I just showed you, are underpinned by 133 indicators, and I'll drill down to the indicator level in some of what I talk about, but if you have questions about how we measure particular components, then I'll answer those and I'll kind of touch on the methodology as I go through. You can see the full list of indicators that we use for the Asia Power Index on our interactive, which is on the Lowy Institute website. That's the best way of getting into a lot of detail if that's what you'd like to do. So in terms of the rankings of the Power Index, these have been fairly consistent over the past 5 years. The United States has always been ranked as the top power in Asia, which is a kind of interesting finding because many people, I think, when the Power Index was first published in 2018, assumed that China had already long ago eclipsed the United States in Asia. But in fact, the past 5 years of data have not shown China on an unstoppable path to overtake the United States. And that gap between the US and China that you can see there, that gap between the US on about 80 points, China on 72 points, that's actually grown over the last few years. The other sort of feature of this chart that I would just draw your attention to, which I think is really important, is just the gap between the US and China on the one hand, and Russia, India and Japan on the other hand. So it's a very considerable gap between those two superpowers and then the rest of the region. And I'll come back to that later on in the presentation. So I'll start out by talking about how the US and China compare in terms of their power, because we can do that on these 8 measures that we look at in the power index. Hopefully the chart I think might be a bit small if you're at the back, so I might need to sort of read it and explain it a little bit. But basically what that chart shows is that the US and China have different advantages in the way that they exert influence in Asia. And this won't be a surprise to any of you to say that China's greatest advantage is its economic relationships, by which we're talking about trade, investment, and also economic diplomacy. China has a nearly perfect score for its economic relationships, and the gap with the US has grown over the past 5 years. The US, by contrast, its biggest strength is its defence networks. And so we're talking there about, for example, combined military exercises, military operations, defence dialogue among senior officials. And China has made very little progress towards closing that gap. So you see on these 2 dimensions, the 2 superpowers present quite differently. And this chart really shows that same information, but in a different way. So you can see the area of greatest US advantage from left to right is defence networks, followed by cultural influence, military capability, and then at the extreme right is China's area of advantage, being economic relationships. There are 2 measures where the US and China are very closely matched. And that's economic capability and diplomatic influence. So I'll talk about both of those measures in a little bit more detail. Starting with economic capability. When we talk about economic capability in the power index, we're not just talking about the size of the economies in GDP terms, we're also talking about the other advantages that give those economies strength. So the role of technology, international leverage, considering the US position as the reserve currency of the world, and importantly, connectivity, so how well connected the economies are with each other. And it was because of China's sharp decline in connectivity during the COVID-19 pandemic, where its border closures and lockdowns were so much more protracted and deeper than for any other country, that the US actually took the top spot for economic capability in this edition of the Power Index. On all the indicators that we look at that measure connectivity as a component of economic capability, China went backwards. So flights into and out of China, the movement of people, whether you're talking about tourists, migrants, students, and then also the flow of capital, all contracted quite sharply. And that explains that strong finding there. So in many ways, I see the Asian Power Index as putting a geostrategic cost on China's choice to remain closed for as long as it did. There's been a lot of discussion about the economic costs for China, but there was also a strategic cost. And of course, now that's changing, has changed already with China's reopening. We can talk about that in the discussion if that's of interest. The other measure where the 2 countries are quite close to each other is diplomatic influence. And that was one of 2 measures where China actually exceeded the United States in this edition of the Power Index. Now, that might be a surprising finding to many people, given that China has confrontational relations with many countries in our region. But I'll show you some charts on the next slide, which explain why that is the case. And yeah, apologies, it is a little small, so I'll just read out what it says. So The chart on the left looks at diplomatic dialogues. So that's all meetings that are held between countries in the Power Index at the foreign minister level and above. That's one of the indicators that we look at for diplomatic influence. And what you can see there is that China was the most active in holding those meetings, followed by the United States. So China is more consistent at meeting a larger number of countries in the region, whereas the US, because it has a global focus and a focus on a few key allies and partners, doesn't have the same level of consistent outreach. For the diplomatic influence measure, we also do an annual expert survey, and that had a similar finding where the US was ranked quite highly for its global diplomacy, but less well in Asia. The chart on the right shows a different picture, which is the comparison between diplomacy and defence dialogues. So when it comes to defence diplomacy, so meetings between defence senior officials, the US is still far and away the most active country in the region, holding nearly twice as many dialogues as the next ranked country, and China is not even in the top 5. So that's consistent with that pattern that I mentioned previously about the US being very strong when it comes to defence networks. So I'll touch now on the role of other powers in the Power Index. And you can see here that, similar to that earlier chart that I showed you, that there is a big gap with Japan and India in particular, not performing as highly as many would expect of those two countries, which is important because both Japan and India are really key elements of US Indo-Pacific strategy. If Japan and India are not going to be as influential as people expect, then that's going to have an impact on the nature of the regional order. So I'll talk a bit about India first and why India doesn't perform as strongly as many might expect, which is, a finding that does sort of receive some pushback from Indian analysts and scholars who are surprised that India's very large population doesn't equate to power that is more comparable to that of China. The reason why India isn't as powerful as perhaps it might be is that it's not particularly well balanced when it comes to its performance across all the measures of the index. So particularly for economic relationships, as you can see on the right there, India's score is extremely low and declining. Its economic influence is concentrated in South Asia, but even in South Asia, it's lost relative influence vis-a-vis other partners like China and, in fact, the United States over recent years. India also doesn't score particularly well when it comes to defence networks, which is a legacy of its non-aligned status and its reluctance to be part of US alliance networks in the region. Part of that dynamic when it comes to defence networks as well is that even though India is doing more in absolute terms to become a more active regional security player, the power index is relative. And so that means that it's actually still going backwards in terms of its score. When it comes to Japan, it's a different picture, of course, and this is a more specific chart looking at Japan's capital investment in other countries in the Asia Power Index. The broad picture that you see from the Power Index, where we look at both 3-year and 10-year flows for capital investment, is that Japan is becoming a relatively less important economic partner for countries in the region, both in terms of trade and investment, as you see here. That's a result of Japan's long-term slow growth, structural challenges, aging population that would be familiar to many of you. Meanwhile, of course, Japan is establishing itself as a more important security actor in Asia, but that's quite slow to show itself in our data. So even though Japan's policy announcements about doubling its defence budget are very ambitious, this was actually the first edition of the Power Index where Japan recorded an improvement in its military capability, and even then it was only a small one. So the sort of headline that I would say about Japan for now is that it's not establishing itself as a regional security player fast enough to compensate for its declining economic influence in Asia. You might have noticed on one of the earlier charts that many countries seem to be going backwards in terms of their power over recent years. And you might wonder why that is. Within the Power Index, we compare power not just within an individual year, but across the past 3 years. And that has enabled us to track the impact of the COVID pandemic on countries in the region. As you would expect, that puts downward pressure on all countries' ability to shape the region around them in a favourable way. But particularly in the area of resilience, countries emerged from the pandemic less resilient than they were going in, especially in terms of their geo-economic security. They have less diversified trade relationships. They were often more dependent on a primary trade partner. And that had an impact on their scores. There are a few exceptions there, Australia being one of them. If you can't read it, you can see that Australia is actually 4th from the bottom. So Australia came out of the pandemic with a comprehensive power score, that was pretty close to what it was going in. The only other countries that did that were much smaller countries in Southeast Asia. I'll talk about their performance in a minute, but I might sort of dwell a little bit on Australia, given that I imagine that would be of interest to many of you as well. So when it comes to Australia, Australia is the 6th ranked country in the Asia Power Index. That might surprise many people to think of Australia as being the 6th most powerful country in Asia. And part of that is because Australia has many advantages that other countries in our region don't have. So a wealthy country, but with a favourable demographic outlook, a very large country with a lot of geopolitical security as a result of our kind of position as an island continent, and also the ability to invest across the whole range of influence measures. So the picture when it comes to Australia is actually quite positive. The area where Australia does the best in the index, as you can see in the chart on the left, is in terms of its defence networks. Australia, unlike many countries in the Power Index that either have an alliance relationship with the United States or extensive regional diplomacy networks, Australia actually does both. So we have the US alliance, but also a lot of relationships with countries in our region, which means that we're actually only second to the United States when it comes to our defence networks. Australia also performs quite strongly when it comes to diplomatic influence. And based on the expert survey that we conducted last year, Australia recorded an improvement in its diplomatic influence because the experts who we surveyed saw the Albanese government as handling relations with Asia better than the Morrison government. But we did that survey only a short amount of time after the election, so it may have been more of a kind of honeymoon phenomenon, and I guess we'll see whether or not that is sustained in the next edition of the index. So I mentioned the smaller Southeast Asian countries and the fact that, quite surprisingly, countries like Brunei and Cambodia have reported strong results over recent editions of the Power Index. I think in those cases of Cambodia and Brunei, it's because they chaired ASEAN in a way that was better than expected. And so they actually got some quite positive scores there from the experts who we surveyed. In the case of Indonesia, I include the chart on the right, which I'll read out because it is very small. just to make the point that Indonesia is among the most diplomatically active countries in our region, contrary to the sort of popular narrative that Indonesia is not active enough. So for this chart on the right, what we're counting there is the number of visits at the foreign minister level and above that each country in the index hosts. And China was the most active for that indicator, followed by Indonesia, then the United States, then Singapore. And this was actually pre-G20, so it's not even as a result of Indonesia being the G20 host. Now, I guess the obvious point to that is quantity doesn't indicate quality. The fact that Indonesia is very active in terms of the extent of its diplomacy doesn't necessarily mean that it's securing positive outcomes. It's very hard to measure diplomatic outcomes for something like the power index. But I do think that this really underscores the point that Indonesia is very highly sought after among countries in our region as an interlocutor, as a partner on foreign policy issues. So this is the last slide, and I know it's very content-rich presentation, so thanks for bearing with me. This is a kind of secondary analysis in the power index that we call the power gap. So I mentioned at the outset the interplay between resources and influence, so what countries have, what they do with what they have. Within the power index, we're able to analyse whether countries underperform or overperform based on their resources and the influence that we would expect them to have. So Japan is the biggest overperformer in the index, notwithstanding what I said about its overall declining influence in Asia. It has the highest positive power gap, meaning that Japan gets a lot of bang for its buck when it comes to its influence in Asia. To me, that's really because Japan is active across the whole range of influence measures. It has economic relationships, it's diplomatically active, it's culturally influential, and it's an increasingly important security partner for countries in the region. I think the power gap analysis also goes to the question of geographic scope. So the 26 countries that we look at in the power index would be quite closely aligned with Japan's foreign policy priorities. So that means that Japan gets that high score, whereas for the United States, its focus is global. And so the United States is just on that list of so-called underachievers, meaning that its influence is not as high as one might expect based on its resources. At the extreme end of the spectrum, at the bottom, you can see Russia and North Korea. North Korea is sort of an interesting one. It does have resources by way of its nuclear weapons, but of course it has no diplomatic relationships, more or less. It has no economic engagement with the rest of the region, and thus that very negative power gap score. Russia is also down there as well on the negative end of that spectrum. I might leave it if you're interested in the discussion or in Q&A and talking more about Russia and how Russia presents kind of generally in the power index, but that's probably enough to go on for now, but be very interested in your questions and feedback. Thanks.
Thank you. We now have half an hour for questions from the audience. Please wait for the intern of the microphone to reach you. We have a question here.
Hello, Susannah. That was amazing and it was very insightful, especially because we're all wondering how the power gap is increasing or decreasing over the years. I'm Ashrika Bharati. I'm a former intern at the Institute and I'm currently writing my honors thesis in India and Australia. So I just wanted to ask you if you could just elaborate a little more upon how you basically evaluated the cultural influence of different countries in the index, just the methodology for that one.
Yeah, of course. And cultural influence, probably along with diplomatic influence, is one of the hardest areas for us to measure in the power index. Within cultural influence, we look at, I think, 3 sub-measures. One is what we call cultural projection, and you can find all of this information is within our report, but cultural projection, so looking at the sort of the way that a country projects, whether in terms of things like its world heritage, how well known it is, how interested countries are in that country on the plan. We look at information flows, so how influential that country's media is within the region, looking at news agencies, newspapers, etc. And we also look at people flows, so how attractive countries are as a destination for migration, for example, tourism flows and so forth. So it is a difficult one, but that's how we attempt to break it down.
Next question.
Thanks for the talk, Andy Green. How much weight do you put on the overall power index? And in particular, how do you weight the relative measures together? I mean, the power index on defence or industry changes with the environmental situation almost and other things. So how do you get your weightings right?
So for the weightings, we do weight within the individual, we do weight both within measures and also across the measures to account for most people's kind of understanding of what are the most important components of power. But we also enable users to go into our interactive and actually assign their own weightings. So if there's something that you think is particularly important or not important, like cultural influence, either to focus only on that or to take it out of the equation if you think it's not important, then you can do that. The sort of assumptions that we make are that economic and military capability are the 2 most important measures in terms of resources, and also that economic relationships are the most important when it comes to the influence measures. So that's kind of consistent with the idea that, you know, the business of Asia is business. People, most countries are more interested in where they're going to get a new source of foreign investment than they are interested in who's going to supply them with a different sort of military capability or, you know, do a combined military exercise with them.
See no hand. See two hands.
Yeah, I understand.
Thanks for the talk. Is there a, you know, the decline you mentioned was a kind of COVID, not anomaly, but they were all going down. We can't be lazy and go to the first year and then just track to this year. Is there a relative decline? Can you control for the pandemic in some way and look at the extent of decline through the region?
It's
Like a relative decline? So.
Oh, right. So you mean, can we look at trends that are kind of independent of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, because I forgot all about the pandemic and I was thinking, oh my God, what does it mean? Everyone's going to be,
Yeah.
It's all going to be terrible.
Yeah. It's quite difficult because many of the things that we measure are affected by something like a pandemic. Countries just do less of the kinds of things that we measure during that period. But I think you can still see that some countries performed better through the pandemic than others, and in many cases there are sort of specific factors that explain that. So one thing I would point to, for example, you know, is that everyone was affected by the pandemic, but not at the same time. So the United States had its kind of really terrible year in 2020, but bounced back quite quickly from there. And then sort of combined, I think, with the effect of the incoming Biden administration, turned into a much more positive story about the United States. Whereas for China, the year that it was most impacted by the pandemic was actually last year. So it's quite difficult to sort of smooth that out and talk about trends that are independent from that. One trend I would say though that is quite notable within the power index is that over time, the middle powers, so the US and China, Japan and India have accounted for a lower share of power compared with China. So that factor that I mentioned about the way they've underperformed, I think is something that we can, that we can point to independent of the pandemic, which really shows, this important question about whether or not the region will be multipolar or will it be characterized as that sort of bipolar competition between the US and China.
I've got the microphone here. It was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. I think I'm building on your question. When I look at all the trends, I ask myself, does it represent a net contraction overall in terms of influence in aggregate form? Or is there something else going on there in terms of how you interpret the data?
So I think because we're comparing across multiple years, yes, basically we are able to see that overall the majority of countries are less well able to influence the region than they were previously, because if we didn't do that, then for example, we wouldn't be able to make the comparison, like the United States might always be the top power in the region, but we wouldn't be able to make the comparison and say, well, in 2018 it had the largest lead and now it's got a relatively smaller lead, so that kind of enables us to track that. But of course it is also just in the nature of power that it's relative. If one country has more power, then that means that another has less, and that can be also one of the sort of difficult conversations that we have when we're doing briefings on the power index in countries in our region, is that many of them will feel that it's unfair that they're doing certain or implementing certain policies which should increase their influence, but because others are doing more, it doesn't have the effect that they would expect on their standing.
Sorry, just a second one then. It might be a little bit off topic, but with the scales you presented in the earlier slides, are they arithmetic or geometric in terms of how you present them and how you determine those numbers?
I'm not sure I understand the.
Well, when I look at, say, the top 2 or 3, I would have thought that visually they would be much larger than what they appear in the slides. So does that represent a geometric or an arithmetic scale?
Sure. Do you know the answer to that?
So it's straight out.
That's fine. So it's like 30, it's twice as high as one.
Right. Yeah.
Was debt part of the analysis? Who has the debt? Who owns the debt of the debtor? In respect to the owner of the debt, has influence on the borrower? I guess that's my question.
So we don't look at debt specifically. We do look at official development assistance and other official flows, which includes foreign lending. So that is a component within economic diplomacy. But yeah, I don't think we look at debt specifically, perhaps as an individual indicator. Jack, that's the case. Yeah. One piece of research that is going to be forthcoming from the Lowy Institute, which will be really exciting in this space in terms of foreign lending within Asia, is you might be familiar with the Pacific aid map, which is the Lowy Institute's accounting of all foreign assistance to Pacific Island countries. We're about to release a version of that for Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, of course, a huge amount of the foreign assistance that's provided is by way of loans rather than grants. And so that will provide, I think, a really interesting kind of complementary analysis where for the first time, because we don't have good data about what non-traditional lenders like China and India are doing, we'll be able to really compare that comprehensively, at least within Southeast Asia.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. One of the things that I think has been a real shift from so-called globalization to regionalization, and I know that you've made a comparison between the United States and China in terms of its economic output and development, but I know also that China has transferred to overcome some of the tariff barriers to America, that they're now investing heavily in places like Vietnam, Mexico, etc. And how is that factored into the economics of China, given the large percentage of government-owned companies as well, their investment in them, and also the influence of the Belt and Road in terms of its investment, which is both diplomatic and economic?
So the first part of the question is about what impact China's kind of overseas business presence has on its power, and then BRI. I mean, I think, you know, all of what you see in the economic relationships measure really attests to the impact that China is having within the region. In terms of its economic footprint. And I think that's consistent with a broader sort of body of analysis which is out there that, that shows China's growing influence. So it's well known in terms of trade that China, of course, is the top trading partner for pretty much every country in the region. But increasingly in terms of investment as well, because we look at investment over a 10-year flow period, we're able to see basically that, in quite a few countries in the index, China is now the top foreign investor. Last year, and this is not something from the power index, but more just a separate point, but last year for the first time, China overtook Japan as being the top foreign investor in Thailand. That's the first time that Japan hasn't had that position since 1994. So there's a huge amount of change there. And a lot of other analysis that you see in terms of the way that the US presents this trend tends to focus on FDI stocks. When it comes to stocks, of course, the US and Japan are still more influential than China. But when it comes to flows, China is really very competitive. And so that's, I think, something that we need to grapple with. And at the same time, China is, for example, renegotiating an upgrade to its free trade agreement with ASEAN, while the US is still not in the game in terms of regional economic integration. What it's proposing through the Indo-Pacific economic framework, doesn't contain trade liberalising provisions. And so it's really unlikely to reverse that sort of trend that we've been seeing. In terms of the BRI, we don't, suppose like the BRI is more, sort of more China's kind of rhetorical construct than anything sort of tangible. And so we don't measure that specifically, but a lot of the investment that China is doing through the BRI would be picked up within our investment data, and also in some cases, if it's concessional, through the data that we include at the moment about development assistance in the region.
Do you get to the Institute, get reactions from the governments of the region or from the United States, you know, saying this is terrific or this is all wrong? Any of that?
Yeah, we definitely do get a lot of reactions. So one of the reactions we get quite a lot is from European countries who ask why they're not included in the power index. And that is because they're not countries in Asia, and we are trying to make this regional in scope rather than global. A lot of the feedback that we get is from countries who are sort of interested in how they can improve their scores. But I think one of the things that's very interesting is that you see a real distinction between countries in the region that kind of culturally embrace the idea of power and that sort of take a very realpolitik perspective on the region versus those who don't. So I think, for example, as Australians, we tend to be quite squeamish about the idea of power. We prefer to think about influence. Others, like the United States, are not like that at all and very much embrace it. And I guess that distinction between countries who sort of embrace the idea of power versus those who don't, you know, I'd contrast the perspectives of India and Indonesia. So India does see the world in quite hard power terms, I think, and finds it a bit disappointing that India doesn't rank more highly than what it does. Whereas the attitude from a lot of analysts in Indonesia is more along the lines of, well, it's not really our goal to be a super powerful country anyway, that would just cause problems with our neighbours. Our focus is on cooperative diplomacy. And so those perspectives that you get are, you know, can be extremely illuminating in and of themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Couple of problems. First, I can't understand the exclusion of the United Kingdom, especially in Southeast Asia. And to illustrate that point, and to come back to the issue of COVID, for those who can't hear me or see me, how would you have accounted for the fact that the Malaysian government, for example, cannot function, and definitely would not have functioned through COVID, if not for the oil revenues. The oil revenues that Petronas brings in will not exist if not for the fact that effectively Exxon on the one side, so that's the US, and Royal Dutch Shell, UK on the other side, keep pumping it up, providing the Petronas with the revenues which then go back to government. I don't see that reflected in your analysis. That's one thing. Second, with regards to Russia, fact is today the Russians have got more presence in the New Straits Times in Malaysia than does Australia or the UK or the US. You've got Russians who write regularly columns about Malay literature and about Islam. And you've got groups like Amazing Hiking, which are effectively Russian women going on hiking trips throughout Malaysia and publicizing their events. I don't think you can discount that. But I might be wrong. Maybe you have included that in your calculus and still come to your conclusions.
So on the UK, I mean, I think I would give the same answer on the UK to any other sort of European country, which is to say that because their focus is predominantly going to be in the sort of Euro-Atlantic theatre, that's the focus of their strategic effort. Yes, the UK has an Indo-Pacific tilt, is interested in doing more in Asia, but its focus is still predominantly going to be in Europe.
Sorry, if I might just step in there very quickly, they ignore the historical context. And I think that's the problem that a lot of Australian analysts suffer from. You forget the historical context. The UK, the US, they're very long time. You know, they don't have to reassert themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose all I would say to that is because their focus currently is not primarily in Asia, the region that we're looking to measure. This is not a global power index, this is the Asia Power Index. That means that it would actually be quite inaccurate and it would overestimate the influence of those European countries if we were to include them. To your point about Russian disinformation, it's my son, coming along, very young for this event though. The question about Russia and disinformation.
Sorry, not disinformation, Russian
Media
interaction.
influence, yeah.
More than media influence, they're interacting with locals, so not disinformation. You must correct that.
Sure, okay. Correction accepted. I absolutely accept that Russia has a degree of influence in Southeast Asia in terms of its narratives, probably more broadly in Asia as well. And we try and measure that in the same way that we measure the media influence of all countries in the region, which is to say that we look at how its news agencies, newspapers, broadcasters, etc. are sought after online across the region. I don't have, off the top of my head, I don't have sort of exactly how Russia performs in all of those measures off the top of my head, but you can look on our interactive and find out. I will say though that it's some of those sort of trends when you're looking at, for example, syndication of content within local media, that is quite difficult for us to track because we're looking at 26 countries, influence in 26 countries. So that makes it quite difficult for us to go down to the level of individual local media outlets and say, you know, how widely taken up is content from any particular country.
Thanks very much. Very, very interesting speech, very interesting statistics. Looking at the power difference between the US and China in the lead and the other players, is this really denying the argument of multipolarity as a coming force and telling us that at least in this region, it's bipolar?
Well, you know, I think part of it depends on what your definition of multipolarity is. And actually it's been pointed out to us recently by a colleague that in fact, what we show in the power index is quite close to China's idea of multipolarity. So when China talks about multipolarity, which it does a lot, it doesn't mean that there are equal poles in Japan and India and Indonesia. It means basically that the US and China are sort of the two global superpowers and everyone else is a head and shoulders below that, which is actually kind of what the Asia Power Index shows. I think the other sort of point to make about the role of, say, the region's kind of second tier of countries like Japan and India, it's very much a glass half empty, glass half full kind of thing in terms of how influential those countries will be. My colleague Hervé Lemahieu, who was the one who established the Asia Power Index methodology, he talks about the concept of asymmetric multipolarity, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the sort of basic idea there is that countries like Japan and India won't be decisive poles in their own right, but the alignment decisions that they make between the US and China are really going to matter. And so that's where the sort of the concept of asymmetry comes in. And I think there's something to that.
Can I just explore a question about just the defence capability? How much is that dependent on, say, the number of aircraft carriers or subs different countries may have? And further, should there be a proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region, which is a potential response to the Ukraine situation? Countries having to depend on their own resources. will that affect that capability measurement significantly?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually look at nuclear deterrent as a component of resilience rather than as a component of military capability. And that's because for most countries, like for your North Korea, nuclear weapons are not necessarily something that they're going to be using in a sort of, real life military scenario, but actually something that gives them the ability to withstand external pressure. So in terms of military capabilities, it is largely focused on those sort of acquisitions that countries have made on their capabilities. And we draw that data from the IISS military balance report each year. And then we complement that with another survey of defence experts. So I mentioned that we do a survey each year of diplomatic experts. We also do one of defence experts. And that's really to get at things that aren't possible to measure in a quantitative way, like, for example, the command and control structures, how well integrated the different services in a particular country would work, how well they're postured for a contingency in Asia. That kind of thing is not really possible to measure using hard data. And so that's why we do that survey to complement, like you mentioned, the number of aircraft carriers, the number of submarines, etc.
Just on that question, do you actually use the SPEARI database?
Yes. Yes, we do use that for, I believe, for arms trade, which is an important component when we're measuring defence networks, more so than military capability, but that's extremely useful source of data for us. SIPWE, I think it is, the Stockholm Institute of Peace,
Right.
I wasn't going to ask the distribution of military assets question, but I will. Before I look at the bars, looking at the United States as an Asia power and the home turf kind of advantage question. If a big chunk of the American bar is military power, and a big chunk of that is based in Europe, for example, what happens if you say, well, they can't really take that away and just move it around?
I mean, I think that is an important question that we have to grapple with in terms of how well postured the US is within Asia. We do that a little bit through that power gap analysis that I mentioned. But we also have research which is forthcoming, which will drill down more into the patterns of influence within individual countries. And I think that will get to some of this issue around the US global versus regional focus, because what some of that research shows is that even though at that sort of big picture level, the US is the most influential power, when it comes to individual countries, for example, in Southeast Asia, that's not necessarily the case. So I think it is something relevant. But I guess the point that I would make is that all countries do have a global as well as a regional dimension of their foreign policy. It's just a question of degree. That's why we kind of rule out the European countries as being outside of geographic scope. We have to draw the line somewhere. In part, we look at sort of membership of Asian regional diplomatic and economic groupings as being one criteria that we look at. That's part of the reason why Russia is in them. But for every country, like Australia has a global focus as well as a focus in Asia. Importantly, Australia has a Pacific focus, which is not captured in what we do, as does New Zealand. So if we were to be considering Pacific Island countries as well as countries in Asia, Australia would probably perform a lot better because in many Pacific Island countries, we would be picking up a lot of points for what we're doing in the week.
If I understood, it's the power as the countries see it between themselves. If there was a cultural element thrown in, such as the number of immigrants from a particular country living, say, in Australia, how much influence they might have on our government's relationship with a particular country, as one possibility, or what the people think of a particular country's. So I'm just thinking, if Ian Thorpe wins the Olympics, then all of a sudden everybody loves Australia and there's pictures all over the place, or if a new terrific Indian movie comes out, or Bollywood dancing or something, does that have any effect on, I'm not sure what I'm asking, but does that have any effect on anything there?
Yeah, so that would have an impact within the cultural influence measure, because it would be, for example, something that would boost, for example, like the online search interest, which is something that we track for each country. But we can't track, for example, down to the level of granularity of like sort of individual sports stars, or for example, what percentage of of drama that's watched on Netflix now is Korean. Like we just don't have the data that would be comparable for all 26 countries. So that is quite a difficult area. But I suppose one point I would make broadly is that, the power index probably sits alongside but separate to the sort of body of research that is public opinion polling and elite perception polling. I think often there can be interesting parallels there, but we're really focused here on trying to track things that have some basis in more tangible data rather than purely perception. But I mean, to give you one sort of interesting example of the way those things can sort of interact with each other. Any of you who are interested in Southeast Asia might follow the annual survey from one of the Singaporean think tanks. It's called the State of Southeast Asia Survey. It's an elite opinion poll, so it measures what strategic elites think about the region. And one of their important findings this year was that there was a declining perception that China was the most important economic power for countries in the region. And to me, that really aligns with what we show tangibly in the power index, which was the impact of the pandemic closure. So we show that through the data in terms of tracking flows of people, of capital, flights into and out of, and then other research can track how that's then perceived or understood.
Okay, well, we might have reached the end of our questions. Okay. Last but not least.
Quick, hopefully. Could you tell us how Taiwan breaks down in its power, particularly with its sort of industrial focus on one particular thing?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Taiwan is a challenge for us to gather the data because, not being a UN member, a lot of the data sources that we use aren't available for Taiwan. Jack, can you, it says it there, doesn't it? Taiwan's ranking is 14th. So it's quite low compared with what you would expect for Taiwan's population and economic size. And that's really a result of the fact that, it doesn't have the diplomatic influence. It doesn't have any of those relationships that we would be tracking for other countries. So it's kind of quite an unusual one within the context of the power index, because if you were to go in, and I mean, we do have a profile and country profile for each country. And if you were to go in and look at the one for Taiwan, you would see that on some things it scores extremely high and on some things extremely low, which is just a result of its kind of strange position within Asia. It's the unresolved study. Thanks.
I'd just like to mention what's coming up here at the Institute. Next week, there'll be another issue of our publication columns from the other colleges, in which councillors and interns recommend readings of other publications that we think might be of interest to our audience. That's part of the sort of post-COVID mood that we've been in now for some years. We're still doing events once every 2 weeks, but that's subject to revision as we all become relaxed and confident. So the following week, which is the 2nd of May, we'll be having another live event here. The launch of a book by Dr. Michael Eason, a business figure in Sydney and a former trade union leader, who's developed a monograph on Whitlam's foreign policy following the publication late last year, an anthology of articles on that topic, including one by him. And the book is going to be launched by our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, the Honourable Miles MP. And so if you come along to that one, if you'd like to, we'll welcome you with open arms. But to round things off this evening, I'd like to invite one of our interns, Bakar Mohammed, to move a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we can all walk away from this evening getting not just something small, but a lot from that. The fact that you can turn something so complex like power into numerical values and summarize it like that is just speaks for itself. So thank you so much. And I think something that we discussed 2 weeks ago when we had the AUKUS debate was some of these values and the diplomatic influence and the regional influence that Australia plays. And then this event came up, and so we discussed amongst ourselves, like maybe this was just a fact check some of the data that we said that night. But I'd like to now move a vote of thanks. So just a round of applause for that.